controls elections in America? Is it the federal government? Is it state governments? Is it local officials? And what happens when these different levels of government disagree on how elections should be run? Today, we're breaking down one of the most misunderstood parts of American democracy, the constitutional framework for election administration. We're going to explain who has power, what the limits are, and why the system was designed this way in the first place. We're also going to talk about something equally important, the role of independent journalism in a democratic system and what happens when that independence is threatened. This isn't about politics. This is about understanding how the system works when it's under pressure. Let's dive in. To understand current debates about election security and administration, you need to understand what the Constitution actually says. Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, which appears very early in the document, addresses elections directly. Here's what it says. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. Let me break that down. First, elections are primarily run by state legislatures. Each state determines how its own elections will be conducted. That's not an accident. The founders specifically did not want one centralized authority controlling all elections because that would create too much potential for abuse. Second, Congress does have a role. The Constitution allows Congress to make or alter regulations about elections, and Congress has done this many times throughout history. For example, in 1842, Congress mandated single-member congressional districts. In 1845, Congress established that the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November would be Election Day. But here's the key point. Even with these federal regulations, states remain in charge of actually administering elections. The Supreme Court has consistently interpreted this clause with great deference to states. In a 1932 opinion, the court stated that Article 1, Section 4 provides state legislators with authority to create a complete code for congressional elections, including registration, supervision of voting, prevention of fraud, counting of votes, and publication of results. So, constitutionally, election administration is primarily a state function with some federal oversight through Congress. Not the president, not federal agencies, state governments, and local election officials. That's the constitutional framework. Now, let's talk about what happens when that framework is challenged. Throughout American history, there have been ongoing tensions between federal authority and state control over elections. Sometimes these tensions are legitimate. The federal government does have constitutional authority to investigate federal crimes related to elections, things like ballot tampering, voter intimidation, or fraud that crosses state lines. But there's a crucial distinction between investigating potential crimes and taking over election administration itself. When federal agents get involved in state election processes, it raises important constitutional questions. For example, if federal agents seize state election records, even with a court-authorized warrant, legal experts debate whether that crosses the line between legitimate criminal investigation and federal interference in state sovereignty. State election officials from both parties have expressed concerns when federal agencies become too involved in state election processes. Why? Because it creates uncertainty about who's actually in charge. Election administration requires public trust. When voters see federal agents at election offices or when federal officials make statements suggesting they should take over elections in certain cities, that erodes trust, regardless of whether any actual wrongdoing has occurred. Here's why this matters practically. If voters don't trust that elections are administered fairly and independently, they're less likely to accept the results. That's true whether the distrust comes from the left or the right, whether it's directed at federal overreach or state incompetence. The constitutional framework exists to create clarity and accountability. States run elections, Congress can pass laws regulating elections, federal law enforcement can investigate crimes, but those roles are meant to be separate. When those lines blur, the system becomes less stable. One recurring claim in election debates is that large numbers of non-citizens vote illegally in American elections. Let's look at what the actual data shows. Multiple states have conducted extensive audits of their voter rolls, specifically looking for non-citizen voters. The results are remarkably consistent. In Georgia, audits found single-digit instances of potential non-citizen registration out of millions of registered voters. In Louisiana, a comprehensive study examined 40 years of voting records and found a few dozen possible cases of non-citizen voting. In Utah, similar audits found virtually no evidence of widespread non-citizen voting. The Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan legal research organization, has documented that eligible citizens who lack ready access to documents like passports or birth certificates number around 21 million people. Here's the constitutional dilemma.
Proposals to require documentary proof of citizenship for voter registration would make it significantly harder for millions of eligible citizens to vote, all in service of solving a problem that data suggests is virtually non-existent. This is where the tension between election security and voter access becomes real. Everyone agrees that only citizens should vote. That's the law. But the question is, how do you enforce that law without creating barriers that prevent eligible citizens from exercising their constitutional right to vote? Different people have different answers to that question, but the data is clear. Non-citizen voting is not a widespread problem in American elections. When political figures claim otherwise without evidence, it raises questions about whether the real goal is security or suppression. There's another dimension to election security that has nothing to do with technology or voter rolls: intimidation. The Voting Rights Act and other federal laws explicitly prohibit intimidation of voters. That includes threatening voters at polling places, using law enforcement presence to discourage voting, creating fear that prevents people from exercising their constitutional right to vote. When federal immigration enforcement agencies operate in communities during election periods, it creates a chilling effect, especially in communities with significant immigrant populations. Even if those operations are legally justified for immigration enforcement purposes, the timing and visibility can suppress voter turnout among eligible citizens who may be afraid to go to public places. This is a real constitutional concern. State election officials have a duty to ensure that all eligible voters can cast ballots without fear. When federal agencies take actions that make voters afraid to go to polling places, that creates a conflict between federal enforcement priorities and state election administration responsibilities. Courts have consistently ruled that voter intimidation is illegal, regardless of who's doing it or what their stated purpose is. The solution to these tensions isn't simple, but it starts with clear communication and coordination between federal and state authorities. Federal agencies should not be operating around polling places on election day unless there's a specific, documented threat that requires their presence. State and local law enforcement should be the primary security presence at polling locations because they answer to state and local governments, not to whoever happens to control the White House. One unusual development in recent years has been the involvement of intelligence officials in domestic election processes. The Director of National Intelligence traditionally focuses on foreign threats to the United States. Their job is to brief the President and Congress on what foreign governments are doing that might threaten American security. Election security briefings from intelligence agencies to state officials have historically focused on foreign interference, things like cyber attacks from hostile nations, disinformation campaigns, or attempts to hack voting systems.
But when intelligence officials become involved in domestic election administration, physically present at state election offices, for example, it raises serious questions. Intelligence agencies have immense surveillance powers. They operate in classified environments with minimal public oversight. Those powers exist for national security purposes, not for domestic political processes. The concern isn't that intelligence officials are necessarily doing anything wrong. The concern is about precedent and institutional boundaries. If one administration can use intelligence officials to investigate state election processes based on claims of foreign interference, what prevents future administrations from doing the same thing for partisan purposes? These institutional boundaries exist for a reason. When they're crossed, even with good intentions, it creates risks that go far beyond any single election. Now let's talk about something equally important to democracy: independent journalism. The First Amendment protects freedom of the press specifically because the founders understood that democracy requires an informed citizenry. You can't hold government accountable if you don't know what government is doing. For that to work, news organizations need to be independent, financially independent from government, and independent from the political pressures that come with proximity to power. When major news organizations face financial pressure and ownership changes, it affects their ability to serve this democratic function. Let's look at what happens when a major newspaper goes through this kind of transformation. A newspaper that once employed hundreds of reporters covering government, international affairs, and local communities makes deep cuts. Foreign bureaus close, investigative teams shrink, local coverage disappears. The immediate effect is that fewer stories get reported, fewer investigations get done, fewer people are watching what government does. But there's a secondary effect that's even more concerning. When news organizations appear to change their editorial approach based on political considerations rather than journalistic principles, it damages public trust in all journalism. When a newspaper that built its reputation on holding power accountable suddenly becomes less critical of powerful figures, readers notice. They start to question whether they can trust what they're reading. This erosion of trust in journalism is dangerous for democracy because it means people don't know where to get reliable information anymore.
If you can't trust newspapers, and you can't trust television news, and you can't trust online sources, where do you get information? The answer for many people becomes they believe what aligns with what they already think. They seek out sources that confirm their existing views. That's called confirmation bias, and it's the death of informed democratic debate. There's a reason why journalistic independence matters so much. When a news organization's owner has significant business interests outside of journalism, contracts with the government, regulatory vulnerabilities, or other financial relationships that could be affected by political decisions, it creates potential conflicts of interest. The question isn't whether the owner is a good person or has good intentions. The question is whether the structure creates incentives that conflict with journalistic independence. If a newspaper's owner also owns companies that depend on government contracts, there's an inherent tension. Aggressive reporting on government might anger officials who control those contracts. That creates pressure, maybe subtle and maybe not, to soften coverage. This isn't theoretical. We've seen it happen. Editorial endorsements getting killed at the last minute, coverage becoming noticeably less critical of certain political figures, entire investigative teams getting eliminated through layoffs. Each of these things might have a legitimate business explanation, but taken together, they create a pattern that looks like editorial independence being sacrificed for other business considerations. The solution isn't simple. Journalism is expensive. Someone has to pay for it. But the ideal model has always been one where the revenue comes from readers, viewers, and advertisers who value the journalism itself, not from owners who have conflicting business interests. When that model breaks down, democracy suffers. There's one more dimension to this that often gets overlooked: local journalism. National news gets a lot of attention, but local journalism is where most government accountability actually happens. Who's watching the county commission meetings? Who's investigating the school board budget? Who's reporting on the sheriff's department or the mayor's office? In most places, that's the local newspaper or local television station. And across America, local journalism is collapsing. Newsrooms that once had dozens of reporters now have 3 or 4. Some communities have no local news coverage at all anymore. When that happens, local corruption flourishes. Officials know that no one's watching. Developers know that no one's investigating their relationships with politicians. Budgets get manipulated without public scrutiny. This affects people's lives in direct, tangible ways. Property taxes going up without explanation. Development projects that damage neighborhoods getting approved without community input. School funding being mismanaged without accountability. The collapse of local journalism is one of the most underreported crises in American democracy. Let me bring this all together. 1. Election administration in America is constitutionally designed to be primarily a state function. Federal involvement should be limited to investigating actual crimes and setting basic regulatory standards through Congress. 2. Claims about widespread election fraud need to be evaluated based on evidence, not rhetoric. The actual data shows that issues like non-citizen voting are statistically insignificant. 3. Voter intimidation is illegal and counterproductive. Everyone should be able to vote without fear, regardless of their community or background. 4. Intelligence agencies should not be involved in domestic election administration. That crosses institutional boundaries that exist for very good reasons. 5. Independent journalism is essential to democratic accountability. When financial or political pressures compromise that independence, democracy suffers. And 6. Local journalism matters just as much as national journalism, maybe more, because that's where most government accountability actually happens. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit the like button and share it with someone who wants to understand how these systems actually work. Subscribe for more breakdowns of constitutional principles and democratic institutions. Drop a comment below. What concerns you most about election security or press freedom? I genuinely want to hear your perspective. Thanks for watching.